What's up, folks? Casual Dad here, and this is the part 3. We're finally going to get through it. This is part 3 of our How to Ladder Effectively and Punch Above Your Weight guides, really geared towards new players, with the aim of letting you kind of compete a little bit more of a higher level than you have been up to now. Maybe, if you want help. If you need help, we'll see. So far, I've done every single faction all the way up to Orcs. I did do a bit of a dip out of my normal format for Servants and Tau. We'll kind of revert back to that a bit. So we're going to go ahead and start with Orcs. Yeah, so we're going to do our last 3 factions here. Hopefully I got this right. And just to go ahead and preface this right out of the gate, the warlords that I consider the best starting warlords are going to be Zagstruck, in large part because his ability is very, very defensive and offensive at the same time and lets you pull up close wins. So the way this works is if a friendly card were ready, it instead attacks for a full melee attack. So full damage on its melee attack, including if you have Inspiring Presence boosting your base attack stat. The reason this guy's really good is that there are cards that will just ready when you deploy them, so you just get a free attack as if they had max level Furious Charge, which is great. But then also anytime you do a ready, like if you have a board of ranged and melee cards and you do a psychic attack, your entire board will do a melee attack without a hit back, unless they're an opposing psyker. So it really lets you get a tremendous value out of your orc cards. And so it's really good at actually defeating decks that are more powerful than yours. Of course, it doesn't do great against pure psychic decks, but then you can fall back on melee or even ranged a little bit. So there are definitely some cards I would look at and definitely include in a Zagstruck deck. He does, of course, benefit a lot from being high level as well, but he's one of the really good ones to kind of play around your opponents that is very effective at low level as well. A close second is going to be Snickrot. His ability is whenever you hit a card off lane. So if you're in the center lane, you hit something to the left, you hit something to the right. If you have Barrage, if you have Death Blow, Psionic Blast, any of those abilities where you're doing damage off your main lane, it does double damage. So an additional 100%. So if you play Target Acquired, 2 of your 3 cards are going to shoot at that thing at double damage. So it adds up real quick. Extremely powerful, but does struggle with running out of steam. So in my decks, I like to mix Target Acquired and Precision Shot, because Precision Shot or Furious Charge will allow you to get a kill on your lane when you deploy. So card drops, kills the card across from it, and then when you actually do your attack, it can hit off lane. So those are both ways you can do that. Target Acquired forces it, and then if you carefully play your Furious Charge and your Precision Shots, those will also allow you to do it too, and really maximize this ability. Because one of the key things about this is that this can peter out. You do have to make sure you are clearing cards, so you have open lanes to shoot stuff, and you only have so many Target Acquired cards. Those are really the 2 I would lean on as your beginners. Badruck is pretty good, but the downside is that he leans on decks that are pretty stacked with expensive cards. His ability is if any of your cards gets a kill with a ranged attack, it then immediately gets to attack again at half of its ranged attack value. So you get a lot of value out of him, but you end up taking very expensive, very heavy-hitting ranged attack cards that eat up your deck points very quickly and aren't particularly good at low level. So he's a middle level to upper level kind of warlord who can be good. And the others all pretty much require high level cards, including Gazgul himself, Big Gaz, Little Gaz. The thing that all 3 of the guys really, really want is high hit points. All 5 of those, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wartsnega has the ability where any of your cards that sub 10 points, when they die, every other card in your deck gets plus 15% to its stats, attack stats, any attack stats, all attack stats, up to a maximum of 5, which is, if I'm not mistaken, what is that? 15 is 30, 60, 75? 60 plus 15, yeah, 75%. So significant buff, but you fill your deck with cheap chaff cards and then have a couple power play pieces that you need to keep alive. And that's more challenging the lower level they are. Then, of course, you've got Gaz, who relies on getting kills, and he himself does nothing until he's actually on the board, and then he's a great tanky piece. But, of course, if your cards are low level, he's not going to save you. And then these 2 rely almost exclusively on hit points, which are particularly low at lower level. So those are ones that are pretty decent at the higher levels, especially New Gaz. I love him. But they will be punishing if you don't have a ton of hit points in your deck. So I don't recommend starting with those early. If you have them and they're decent level, you can try it, but all melee, and needs a combination of a bunch of drops and high hit points, so he's kind of challenging. Now to look at some of the bodyguards, I'm going to pick out some of the key pieces that are really, really incredibly powerful. If you are lucky enough to have the 10-point red Gobbo. No, not that one. Where's the 10-point? that one. Taunt and Endless. This guy is dumb. He's completely insane. So, of course, he's got Taunt, he's got good hit points at higher level, and then he also has Endless. So if you kill this thing, he dies and then respawns and does it again, or he's a second copy. And since he's legendary, that can be a second copy at full 200 hit points. That again will have Taunt all over again. So incredibly powerful piece to keep your other cards alive, especially at that 10 points. All the red gobos are pretty good, but that one stands out as being really insanely good. Note this guy is 1 point over 10, so he's not going to trigger the Wartsnagger bonuses, but still is very good, and does have Death Blow. So he's pretty powerful with Snickrot, because you can do those off-lane booms when he dies. Not going to talk too much about those. There's some cool new cards in there. The really expensive cards, they are very, very, very good. Everything in this band is incredibly powerful once you get it high leveled. When it's low level, it sucks, because the cost is crazy for the value you get out of it. Two of the worst low level cards are going to be this guy, because you're looking at a very high cost and incredibly low stats that really only are justified by the very high hit points and Berserk, which you don't have at low level. And then this guy is one of the single best cards in a Zagstruck deck because he has both Furious Charge and the Ready. So if you play this on your turn, you drop him, he readies, does a full melee attack. Furious Charges, does whatever melee attack he has at that level. Right now mine's a 40% melee attack. And then if it's your turn, he attacks a third time. This thing will attack 3 times on your turn, which is bananas. Good for obvious reasons. I really like this one in my Snickrot decks because he has that precision shot with a very high ranged attack. So particularly good at clearing the lane he's in and then taking those off-lane shots for the Snickrot bonus. Great one to put in there. Of course, this is kind of a standard piece in both your Badruck and your Snickrot decks because it has everything. The cost's not terrible, great hit points, a melee attack, and then it has Barrage on top of a very effective ranged attack. This is a very good card. One of these at the higher level that actually trades fairly well if you don't have it leveled very highly is this one, because its base melee is quite high. So at lower level games, it's got a good amount of hit points for the cost and good melee. You start getting a couple of levels of Berserk in there, so he's not bad, even starting at like level 7. He's kind of worth taking. Still a high risk, so I'd be very careful with this unless you have the support pieces like the Medica and Taunt to keep him alive. But he's one to consider if you are laddering fairly early in your Warhammer Combat Cards career. Yeah, orcs are actually quite tricky because they do tend to be very level dependent. They have a lot of traits that feed on top of each other that are very effective, but do require a couple levels invested to actually get up there. Another piece that I personally really like that's been pretty effective for a long time. He was especially effective for me around here. This is kind of where I ran him a lot when I was laddering with orcs early on before my stuff was fairly high leveled. Between here and here, between level 6 and level 10, this was a solid piece. He's got good stats with good abilities, has both ranged and melee. That Furious Charge is a really nice utility piece, especially again in those Zagstruck decks. Any card that has Precision Shot and a high melee attack and or Furious Charge and good melee attack is really good in Zagstruck decks because then you're just stacking the bonus attacks up. So that's a pretty great one. A lot of these I tend to skip over. This guy I'm using quite a bit now, especially in my Supreme Commander Gaz decks, because he's got good hit points and he has shields. So good cost for the shields, and that insulates his hit points so that my drops with Big Gaz do additional % damage because his health stays high, even as he starts taking damage initially. He can supercharge drops for longer than some of the more expensive cards that have a little bit more hit points but lose them quickly. Similar story for this guy. I tend to prefer this one. He's only 2 points more expensive, but his ranged attack is dramatically better, which is good on both offense and defense. So if you charge up, if you're doing a mostly melee deck, it's still nice to have a good ranged puncher, both because it will shoot back if your opponent is shooting at you, but then also as you're doing your melee attacks, you're building up a bonus to your ranged attack, and you could throw some haymakers once in a while if it makes sense, math-wise. This is one of my absolute favorite cards in the entire Orc faction. Great combination of stats, cost, and abilities, especially once you get him upper level to that level 9 where he gets that Furious Charge as well. But he doesn't need that. He's already got Inspiring Presence plus very decent both melee and ranged. Really excellent piece in any Orc deck. Mad Doc is always a tricky one to justify. Orcs do tend to have a lot of high hit point cards as you start to level them up, and he's got both high hit points and Medicae, and a pretty decent melee attack stat. So he's very, very good. He's just very expensive when there are a bunch of cheaper Medicaes. But I still always kind of keep him on the edge of my lists to include him at some point when there's a hole that makes sense. I especially like this guy in Mozrog decks because he has the high base hit points himself, so he both tops everything off with Medicae, but then also benefits from the trait while doing decent melee damage as he's attacking and healing up. This guy is a staple in your Zagstruck decks because, of course, he is a Psyker, so if you're up against a non-Psyker deck, you can hit them back with Psychic when they hit you for Psychic, but then also he's got the board clear. So one of the things that Zagstruck really hates is Akaran and shields, and this guy is a really effective piece to clear both shields and also deal with those injured Akaran cards and just chip away at stuff that your other cards may batter themselves against, because Zagstruck decks can be a little bit glassy, where they do a bunch of damage but also die quickly. So great piece in there to support them, keep up that momentum, and punch through kind of the tougher walls. Of course, you start getting your cheaper Medicaes. Any Medicae is good. And I'm kind of skipping around here. I'm going to jump to the cheaper part because these are some of the staples of orcs. Here is your 6-point target acquired. Very, very good in a lot of decks. Great both in Snickrot decks because he's target acquired, triggers those off-lane attacks, and then also in your Schwarzenegger decks because he's very effective at... he's got a great utility ability and then is under 10 points. So he will trigger the bonus for everyone else when he dies. When he dies, because he always dies. This guy is a wonderful combination of traits. 5 points for okay hit points, but very good melee attack, and then the combination of Death Blow and Furious Charge. This is one of those guys that does exactly what he should with that model. Gets a bunch of damage in very quickly and then blows up. So he's a great piece. Does what it says on the tin. Kerboom. The Endless cards are also particularly good. This guy's an easy mainstay, just your standard boy. Just got a recent buff to his attack stat, so he's no joke either. Especially for 5 points. Really good filler piece to throw in there just to do it. Very orky, fits with the theme of everything. Great piece. Makari is one that I'm always like, he doesn't have any attack whatsoever. Why would I bring this? And then he always ends up in my decks and is shockingly effective. If you're running up against a lot of range shooting decks, this is a great defensive piece to go ahead and take those down. He's also 7 points with a giant chunk of hit points and Inspiring Presence. So he's really good at supercharging your deck for a low cost, and he will stick around for quite a while too, especially once you start getting those shields. But even before that combination of cost for hit points is pretty much unheard of. I talked about key cards for Zagstruck decks. This is a key one because that melee ready means you drop this guy and he attacks immediately. So to take out an injured card, clear a shield before your melee attack, just get additional attacks on the board, this 8-point card is absolutely worth it. And in any other melee deck, he's a strong one to consider because he will, on the drop, supercharge your melee attacks for your other cards as well. So very good at keeping up that momentum, particularly with Zagstruck, but in general as well. Obviously, orcs are a very melee-heavy army, but they do have quite a bit of good shooting as well, and we'll see some of that too. Another Endless piece that's very strong, more on melee attack, comes in at almost double the price point. He's still under 10, so does the same things the other guy does. But the biggest feature about this guy is you can have him with the other Endless cards, so instead of 2 cards, you've got 4, because they will redeploy after dying. Very good. I prefer this guy of the 2, just because his melee stat's a little higher and his hit points are a hair higher. But the 5-point is probably better in a shooting deck, especially for the cheaper cost, because a lot of those shooting cards are quite expensive. Looking at Goff Rocker, this is a weird one. Just got a big buff and has pretty phenomenal stats, plus stacked with Inspiring Presence. I had said I was going to go ahead and use him. We'll see. I'll put him out there at some point. Let's see. Those are kind of the major ones. There are a couple I do like to point out as standouts. Another great one in Zagstruck for exactly the same reasons as the first one. This guy's just bigger. More or less does the same thing. Brickfist the Storm Boy. In the running to be my first max level card. We're so close. We're so close. Super powerful piece. Really good melee attack. Very meaningful range for a 15-point card. Definitely one to put in a lot. And of course in your Zagstruck decks with the extra bonus attack. Spookums I really like too because his melee attack is awesome for the target acquired. So it's hard to justify taking him when Baz is right there at 6 points. But if you do take him, you'll get a lot more use out of him than you will out of Baza. It's just a question of if you could do something better with those 10 points than you do here. Or you take both. But yeah, I really like Spookums, mostly because of the name. But he's a really, really great piece too. Of course, this is one of the most ridiculous taunt cards in the entire game. Doesn't compare with that 10-point Red Gobbo, the Endless Taunt, but this thing is still bonkers. In any ranged deck, it's got the ranged ready, which is really good, and then also, of course, has taunt and a bunch of hit points and a very good ranged attack, and the ranged ready, if you do a ready or a melee attack. Really strong for the points. This guy comes into a lot of my decks as well. hilariously has Makari in it, but you can also put it in a deck with the other Makari. But yeah, so you can have max Makari, and that is something you should do just for good karma. Good orkiness if you run either of the Gazes, because Makari is Gaz's buddy. We'll take a real quick look at some of the decks I've put together for these guys. I do want to go ahead and shout out these ones real quick. Both of these, kind of your standard knobs, are quite good. So the anti-infantry on this guy at 13 points, great hit points. Anti-infantry is really, really good at taking cheap cards and making them really effective against some of the other cheap cards in the game. Very good. So they trade positively. They trade well. That's the thing I can say about this guy for sure. He's a staple of my Supreme Commander Gaz deck right now. And then this guy as well, throwing in that Furious Charge is particularly good too. He's a little bit more expensive. I think, what, 1 point? Yeah, 13 and 14. They're both very good. Like, they just offer really good stats for the cost. They're excellent pieces to put in any efficiency deck, and if you put both in there, you just have so many other points to throw around, and they will both perform fairly well. Those are kind of the key cards I wanted to highlight. Red Gobble with Taunt and Deathblow. Yeah, I like that one too. This is a good one. All the Red Gobbles are good. If you are a serious collector, you could somehow get all of the Red Gobbles eventually. They do pop up in the store here and there. Yeah. And I don't want to dismiss the other cards in here. A lot of these are quite good. You've got your Outflank. You've got your other range shooters, your Barrage, your kind of cheaper cards in here. But I just don't use them as much, and I don't consider them to be as effective as the cards that I've really pointed out so far. There's a lot of other stuff in here that you can especially use at higher level. This one's pretty decent at higher level. I really love this guy because he's got all 3 attack types and Berserk, which just, I love it. I just need him to get to that level 9. And then the higher level I get him, of course, but 9 is where I really want him to be, where he can be super, super effective with that bonus psychic attack. This guy is really worth mentioning because he is high level with shields at a middle price point. This guy's worth mentioning because at high level he's basically unstoppable and has Berserk. This thing, once you start getting higher level to about here, is a monstrosity. If you have a ranged orc deck and you can throw a level 6 or higher Mangler in there, very, very potent. I believe this guy's good too, but significantly worse because he's more expensive and doesn't have the Barrage. Slightly higher stats, better hit points, also has shields, but he still just doesn't compare with the Mangler. And the Mangler doesn't really compare with this guy, which is Precision Shot and Barrage. This guy's real good. Yes, he comes in at 90 points, so you got to make sure you support him and make sure that you keep him alive, but that'll do the work. Similar to this guy too, Big Game Hunter and Barrage. Get that guy at level 6. Yeah, 6 or 7. He becomes very, very frightening. But of course, all very expensive, and most of the Orc Warlords are expensive as well, so you have definitely kind of a bit of a give and take there. So let's look at the decks real quick so I can make sure to hit the other factions as well. There's my Zagstruck deck. Just to talk about it, it mostly leans on efficiency. I've got this guy in here for the triple attack. Attack on drop, attack on drop, attack on drop, plus Psionic Blast. Target acquired, just to deal with those pesky cards, and because I had the 6 points. Really good at holding down a lane, so I've got the 1 high hit point shields guy in there for holding down a lane, and then also those defensive ranged shots. And then, of course, this guy for the Inspiring Presence and the Furious Charge. Great stats overall, great cost, and that Inspiring Presence is really, really good for making sure you get a little bit more out of your melee attacks throughout the game. Let's see, we're going to jump to the other one, and I did say Zagstruck and Snickrot are probably the best starting out. This one has a little bit of everything. It's kind of balanced with melee, but I've got my Barrage card in there. I've got my Taunt card to keep my other cards alive. Psionic Blast, Furious Charge, and then a Medicae to kind of top everything off. Plus my Efficiency card, and then my 1 target acquired. I might tweak this to add the 2nd target acquired. And then see what else I could fit in there, because that would be a fairly comfortable piece. But this is a pretty effective deck that I really enjoy, especially since my Snickrot himself has gotten to quite a dangerous point where he also has Furious Charge and Fear. Yeah, you see a lot of other decks that do a little bit more Barrage and focus more on ranged. I like the flexibility of this one personally. But I won't say it's the top tier Snickrot deck. It's just the one that I've put together. Let's see who else we got. I will go ahead and take a quick look at some of the others. If you're doing a Zodgrod Wartsnaga, you do want a kind of a mixed deck. This is a tricky one. I've gone ahead and gotten probably too many cards in there. just looking at it. So the thing about him is, like I said, you want a couple power pieces. Here I've got the Mad Mangler and the Mech that will benefit from the attack buff dramatically, and then you want a bunch of sub 10-point cards to throw in there to kind of feed it. And then, of course, the Taunt and the Psionic Blast both will benefit from the attack buff, but then also are there to keep my other cards alive. Give me a little extra momentum. So the Psionic Blast is just so good for clearing out and making sure you don't hit too much of a target and shields and Akaran cards. So it's just a great tool to put in basically anything. Moving on to Zag. No, look at Badrak. See actually what I have here. I don't run Badrak very much, so this is pretty typical where you have the most common Badrak deck you see out there is 3 heavy hitters. So you've got that truck, one of the 2 planes, usually not that one, but sometimes that one, and then the shielded truck as well, and then fill with a couple extra pieces. I mixed this up a bit to be a little bit more melee heavy. His ranged attack is still good. This guy's ranged attack is still good, but this is a little bit more flexible to where it can fall back on a secondary attack of melee if you want. Still probably not a great build, but that's kind of what I put in there and wanted to go ahead and kind of talk through the archetype as well as what I've got on paper here. Next, we're going to look at the Gazes. This Gaz, every time one of your Orc cards kills a enemy card, Gaz himself gains +10 base melee attack, which adds up real quick and does a whole lot of damage. He's fine. But again, he doesn't do anything until he hits the board, and he sure does make a splash when he hits the board, but you better be winning by then, because otherwise he can get overwhelmed quite quickly. But so you see what I've got in there. I've got the Psionic Blast, I've got the Angry Psyker, and then of course I've got this guy in here. I really love Psychic Orcs, so I've got as many of my Psychers in here as I possibly can, just to kind of play around with that and hopefully get some kills. They're very flexible, and I've got double Medicaid here, and then my Anti-Infantry, and of course Makari, kind of to spread out the points generally, because Gaz himself is very expensive. So this is just kind of a balanced deck, mostly to try the proof of concept Psychic, more than to actually win in the ladder. And then, of course, we have Supreme Commander Gaz, who he's kind of a weird one, where you really want to balance your hit points with your number of drops, which I've kind of failed on that. Again, really good hit points that both have defensive abilities that keep those hit points on the board longer, which is really good for the drops. And then I just sort of spread the points out here with the very efficient trades. The Endless, who will trigger the Gaz thing twice because he deploys twice. And then Makari, of course, being that 7-point that deploys quite a bit as well. I could squeeze a little bit more in here, but because of the sheer cost of Supreme Commander Gaz, this is a really good compromise, and this has been really effective for me. I'm going to try to hit it to 3K this season. We'll see how far I get. So that is Orcs in a nutshell. There's, of course, more to cover, but that's kind of the key stuff I wanted to highlight. We're going to go ahead and jump to Tyranids to make sure we have time to cover that one, and then Votann we'll do at the end, which should be quite a bit faster. Quite a bit faster. This is a golden age for Tyranids. I'm actually really glad I waited to do this one, and so I didn't do it too quickly, just because they're in a great spot. Because they're a very melee-centric faction, and they've gained a lot of different buffs to melee in a time where the game is just starting to move away from range being so much more powerful. We're seeing a lot of buffs to melee, a lot of abilities that impact melee, and a lot of things that kind of balance out the emphasis on ranged, which does make Tyranids a little bit safer because they mostly trade very effectively at melee, but are somewhat vulnerable to being shot. So looking at all of the Warlords, the one that I personally consider the best for a starter, for a low-level player, and actually one of the best, possibly the best starter Warlord in the entire game, is the Tervigon. This thing is so good. It's just, so its abilities, it just gives you a free card, a free infinite card, where you always have the option to deploy a Termagant. Just a little ranged guy, does very little low hit points, but you just have it all the time to whittle cards down, clog up lanes, and just kind of be there. And just having access to an extra free card, even if it's once, is amazing for a low-ranked player, but it's just absolutely incredible if you can use it all game. Now, that does mean that it encourages running a fairly thin deck, so that you always have the option to deploy your Termagant, instead of one of your more expensive cards, because it's a little bit random when you'll actually see the option to deploy it. So you could have a full hand of cards and none of them is the Termagant, and you won't be able to redeploy it over and over again until it actually appears in your hand. So you run a very thin deck with the Tervigon, and you can get a ton of efficiency out of your cards. Here's the rub. So aside from the Tervigon, none of these Warlords are particularly good for starting players. If your cards are low level, all of these are going to struggle dramatically. The one that will beef your stats the most is going to be Gosar. Just every single turn, all of your cards gain +3 melee attack, even if they're in your deck, which is awesome, especially with Furious Charge to pop out. But it's no defense on it. Your hit points are still going to be low. Even with this buff, a lot of your melee attacks are still going to be fairly low. And he himself is extremely squishy. So, and especially at the price point. He's quite expensive for how few hit points he has, especially at middling level. So I definitely would not start with him. But if you want to, he's a very aggressive playstyle that can be very rewarding. Yeah, it's just he struggles to compete in the ladder because he'll have a lot of bad matchups where he'll just get smacked down. Zemat is also really good, supercharging your ranged attacks. And Tyranids have some decent ranged shooters. They're not getting new ones as quickly as they're getting other types of cards, but it can really perform very well and is unusual in that it is emphasizing your ranged attacks. So the first time any of your cards makes a ranged attack, it does almost double damage. It does an extra 75% damage, which is really good. But obviously that also lets your cards run out of steam. So you have your cards, you're getting the attack bonus with them, and then they lose it, and then you're just like, all right, what do I do with this card now? It's nowhere near as good. For me personally, the Warlord I was most successful with kind of mid-level and above. One of the really effective ones was this guy. This one is an absolute chunker, and even at low level, he starts with shields rank 2 and a pretty decent melee attack. So even at the absolute base level 1, this is a really good closer. He's very difficult to deal with, does a bunch of damage, and can actually carry you through the end of games where you would normally lose. He's one of those Warlords you can play in the middle of the game and still win, because it takes so much to bring him down. He's extremely expensive for it, but I still really love this card. He's also got a defensive ability in that whenever your opponent attacks you, whatever attack type they used receives a debuff, so an automatic anti-ready from the Swarmlord himself. So if they're all ranged and just keep shooting you with ranged attack, it's going to nerf their attacks every single turn. So just hope that they're not a very flexible deck that keeps changing up the types. But it's very good. And it's easy to forget that because you look at him and you're like, this is a stats card. It's just all about his raw stats. And it's easy to underestimate the amount of defensive benefit he's giving you all game long with that adaptive strategy. Really strong, still good for starters. The Flyrant, the ability is every single turn a random enemy card just loses 15 wounds, goes through shields, hits off lane. This is, I think, one of the only Warlords in the entire game who can kill opposing bodyguards that are not in a lane of any of your cards, which is really good. Like, say you have an Akaran card down to its final 5 hit points, doesn't have a second life or anything, but you have nothing in the lane to attack it, so you can't get rid of it. If you're lucky, this will still remove it in a turn or two and really clear up that lane for you, which is great. It's a relatively low amount of damage on an extremely expensive card that, especially at low levels, is easy to take down. Still good. It's just kind of hard to justify this one, and a very challenging Warlord to play in general, especially at lower levels. Jumping around a bit, one of the ones that may now be the best starter Warlord out there is the Parasite. Because we're talking about a melee-heavy faction, and this ability now is the first time an enemy card is hit by a melee attack from one of your friendly cards, it will take 110% damage, so an extra 10% damage on the base, and then when that card dies, after it has been hit by at least one melee attack, it will deal 40% of its base wounds to adjacent targets. So you get explosive enemies, so it's like giving your opponent unfriendly death blows. So that plus 10% base damage on the attack is really good to make him a very aggressive Warlord, supercharges your big heavy hitters, and then he then has a melee version of Barrage. So I would personally rate the Parasite as actually the single best Tyranid Warlord right now. With all the melee cards that have come out, with his cost, with the plus 10% melee damage, this is a great, great time to play the Parasite this season right now with the Custodes. He also got a soft nerf in that melee is getting better, so you're going to run into a lot more counter melee decks, but that's kind of good because the Parasite is really good at trading effectively with those decks, whereas it's not as good at trading effectively against ranged decks. So, awesome piece. Of the three, or of the 6, I would definitely start with Tervigon, Parasite, and Swarmlord in that order. Swarmlord is still my most effective laddering Tyranid Warlord so far, but I think Parasite's going to surpass him this season, which is very exciting. Taking a look at the bodyguards, there are a bunch that I don't have. I especially really enjoy the cheaper ones, like the cheap cards that have popped out recently have added a lot of tools to the toolbox, and then also the Warlord rotation that's been added not too long ago. that allows you to not face Badrak all the time, so you're not just feeding Badrak by including cheap cards, is phenomenal. So stock's way up on the cheaper cards. This is one I really want because I have an all Psyker deck with my Swarm Lord that we'll look at in a second that would absolutely love having a 6-point Psychic buff and Inspiring Presence. If you have this guy on the board when you're doing Psychic attacks turn after turn, it stacks both Inspiring Presence and the Psychic buff, so it really charges up your Psychic attacks, especially since their base is actually quite high. So that, so the percent buffs will be very effective. This one I remember being good. Yeah, Big Game Hunter and Barrage, 24 points, but that's a great ranged card, especially once you hit level 9. Before level 9, it's okay, but then once you get up to level 9, regain that Barrage and that Precision and that Big Game Hunter, that's a really scary piece. Of course, in the Zemat decks, which clearly built for. Let's see what else we got. A lot of these cards I don't really know that well. I don't see them very often. I believe they are good. Like this guy, I think I regret missing out on. Yeah, that one's particularly good, but we have another Hive Tyrant anyway. And then this one, yeah, Furious Charge. Yeah, that's a good one. Stocks are down a little bit on Tyranid and Furious Charge because of the Parasite. If you're doing anything but a max level Furious Charge, with a Parasite, you're actually losing out on damage by doing that, because if you use Furious Charge to hit a card for the first time, you are reducing the actual 10% bonus you would get from attacking in melee for the first time, right? So you probably don't want to open with your Furious Charge cards. You want to save those to go against injured enemies or enemies that need just a little bit extra to kill, so you can get the full 10% bonus of your melee attacks by hitting them outside of Furious Charge. Just to go on up here, the Norns are insanely powerful once you get decent level, because they just have such a combination of stats and hit points, and then also come stock with target acquired. They both have that. One is Psychic in melee, the other one is ranged in melee, and they get real scary. But of course they are 80 points, so I generally consider them better only one of them in a deck, and especially at the 400 deck point mode where you can comfortably spend 80 points. This thing is horrifying. Quite possibly one of the best ranged cards in the entire game. The combination of Barrage and Poison on a legendary card that can go up to max Poison will just dissolve entire enemy lines. And so it's a good thing that it comes in at 118 squad points, but a really good piece in a Turbigon deck, because that justifies having a thin deck with a very effective piece in it, but then you also have infinite chaff cards to throw in and can protect its flank. So very good. I don't have a high level of this one, so I can't really speak to it, and it's fairly new, so I haven't really seen it. This one is interesting. You don't see people run this guy very often, but he's extremely good in a Parasite deck, because he has that very high base melee stat that is benefited by the 10% bonus, and then also has anti-infantry, which stacks with your 10% bonus. So a lot of the stickier, scarier cards out there are infantry cards that have shields or infantry cards that have taunt. And this guy has the combination of stacking anti-infantry stuff, so anti-infantry plus high base stat plus the 10% from the Parasite. This one is very good at getting kills. And consistently getting kills allows this guy to do that supercharge hit where he is charging up the Parasite explosion attacks and really is good at clearing lanes. This one's been super effective this season, and I'm really happy to have it in there. Previously, it had Deathblow, and I do miss that, but I think that infantry has turned out to be much more valuable. Just think of every single Space Marine and every single Servants of the Emperor, every single Chaos deck. Almost all of them have those 14 to 5 point taunt cards that are infantry that take a long time to chew through, whereas this guy will one-shot it, which is very good. I wish this one was good. This is a really tough one to justify because it's so expensive, but it's got so many hit points with Berserk and then both attack types that I see why it's expensive. It's just very hard to justify bringing. This, on the other hand, is one of the best cards in the game. Up until recently, where I've talked about melee being better in Tyranids, this was probably the single best card in the Tyranid deck because it's got a decent melee, but mostly it's got shields and a ranged attack. So you would run decks that mostly leaned around this guy being your ranged attack. The other cards would just do whatever they did. But you'd have this guy as kind of the mainstay to keep your deck alive, because Tyranids really were playing a defensive game where they needed to survive games, and this was your key piece to do it. I think stocks are way down on this guy. Still obviously an incredible piece in a Zemat deck, still a very strong defensive piece, but you've got so much more incentive to run the other attack types now that I am happily leaving this guy on the shelf a little bit more often because he used to be in everything. Even my Gosar deck started with this guy and started with shooting, which was... didn't love it. It was very effective, but I didn't love it. Moving on up, this is one of the best Psychic cards in the game. Comes in at 50 points. And of course, I've been lucky enough to get mine to level 11, which makes it quite very, very scary. But Psionic Blast is just an incredible ability. Having Psionic Blast and Shields is incredibly powerful. Also having a not-nothing melee attack on top of that, very, very good. So this guy also similarly has fallen out of favor with this guy just with the sheer volume of new amazing cards Tyranids have gotten. But it is one that was, for a long time, an absolute mainstay in my decks. I'm going to talk a lot about these because Tyranids have some really good chaff cards, so their upper-end cards actually see a lot more play, and they very quickly get cheaper. We're going to see that happen quite quickly. This guy here, Old One-Eye, one of my favorite lore characters, and formerly had... I forget which trait he had. Formerly had a different combination of traits, but recently got Endless. Something with these stats with Endless and Berserk, of course, in combination with the other abilities you can run in the game. This guy's super, super fun to play. I still think he's relatively weak because his base melee attack isn't very high. Until you get to level 11 or so with a very high base melee and then also the much higher Berserk, then he gets better. But that Endless, he still doesn't do as... doesn't die, which is great. That's what he's supposed to do. Does decent melee attack, but still... his overall damage output falls short. Even with Endless, his overall damage output across the game falls short, and so he loses momentum against a lot of opponents that you need to beat more quickly. So he's good, I think dramatically improved, but I personally don't usually run him, just because you have so many other punchier options so close. This one recently got a great price cut, which is amazing, because it has very good stats and has that psychic attack. I believe it got a buff to damage, and then also got the reduction to points cost, which is great. This is now in a lot more of my decks, and I never even considered it before because it was just too expensive relative to the other options. Now that I'm leaning more heavily on melee warlords, and I'm running the Swarm Lord less, it's a lot easier to justify this guy, and that combination of hit points and attack stats plus Inspiring Presence is very good. Yeah, he's a great piece. This is one of the strangest cards in the game. It will be run in my Zemet decks eventually, but for the moment it's a ranged attack card with a very high melee attack, which is great because you can just play it as a melee card, but then all of its traits kind of benefit ranged. So I think it's really good, but it still is a little confusing to wrap my head around, and I haven't really played it much. This is one of the best shooting cards in the entire game, hands down, but it is legendary. It takes an extremely long time to level up, and at this level of 4, it's really not very impressive. But once you get to level 6, and then anything beyond that is just gravy. That combination of Barrage and Fear is super, super good to keep this guy on the board and doing a lot. And he also has a very good melee stat on top of it. So it's just both a combination of flexible, very dangerous, and a really good combination of traits, both of which can hit max because it is a legendary card. Really like this one, but again, a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about here reflects that I used to run ranged Tyranids, which are now not as necessary. Ranged Tyranids used to be the way that you won, where you do a lot of shooting stuff with any of your warlords. But now that we can actually dip into melee, it's completely changed how I'm laddering with the faction in general. That brings us to this guy, which is... looking at this, so you could either pay 9 points more for this guy, which of course has great stats, decent hit points, has Inspiring Presence to bump up the rest of your deck, but 48 points versus 41, so 7 more points, which isn't that crazy. But look at that base melee. Almost double base melee. That's without Inspiring Presence, but you have other sources of Inspiring Presence. So 7 points more, much better melee, same hit points, but also has regen to keep it on the board, and that range debuff as a way to kind of stay alive. This is a really strong piece, especially with that regen keeping it kicking around. Still vulnerable to Big Game Hunter, but a really cool piece to have in there. Then we got, I'm going to skip around a bit here. You've got your glass cannon here, your ranged glass cannon, and then your melee glass cannon. This guy hits extremely hard when he gets to a decent level with the Furious Charge. So very good in Gosar decks because you can charge up that melee, but then also pretty good in Parasite decks because he has that good melee, and that Inspiring Presence to supercharge all your cards. Very good at doing multiple attacks to that Furious Charge. Excuse me. But yeah, both of those tend to die quite quickly, so they are impactful on the board, but I end up swapping them out for a lot of stuff too. The cheaper Inspiring Presence and some of the more durable range cards are the ones I tend to use more, but I wanted to mention those because they come up a lot and they can be very effective. This thing, if mine wasn't level 4, I would be running this thing all the time because Psionic Blast plus Fear is such a phenomenal combination of traits. It's arguably better than shields in most situations because you're just flat reducing the damage you're taking rather than having something that can be taken away. So this thing, when it's at low hit points, it still is not taking much damage and can survive much longer than a card with 2 or 3 shields that get stripped off. Yeah, real good. Low hit points, which is definitely an issue, and is fairly level dependent, but extremely powerful, and I really am excited that it is a fear-based Psyker in Tyranids that also can have Psionic Blast at a higher level. So very level dependent, but I wanted to make sure to shout it out in case you have a high level one. These 3 are some of the best cards in the entire game, hands down. Tyranid Prime has that melee ready plus target acquired. Stats kind of suck at level 3, but you start getting up here, it's super good. That combination of a really hard-hitting, high hit point card that also has target acquired is one of the things that makes like the Raven Guard guy, Shrike, really stand out. And he's basically a Shrike equivalent who doesn't have the range and trades for that, for having dramatically higher melee and I think higher hit points. So really strong piece. This guy is insane. For the cost, not vulnerable to Big Game Hunter, has Berserk, so he builds up a lot of hit points, and then has Berserk plus Death Blow. So the entire time this guy's on the board beating stuff up and just not dying, you are charging up a bomb. So this guy in a Gosar deck is crazy bananas. This guy in a Parasite deck is really, really effective. For that price point, it's an excellent piece. Can be a little level dependent, because if you're in that 50 damage range, he's not as good. I would really start running him when you have that rank 3 Berserk, at minimum. This one, oh my god. Death Leaper, one of my favorite card redesigns ever, was giving Death Leaper the primary trait of Fear. This was another glass cannon that was on the board, did a bunch of damage, and then died quite quickly. Now this guy can easily stick around for an entire game. Not only does he have just the really high melee attack, but that Fear really, really helps supercharge his durability, especially since now we've seen the addition of several Fear cards. So you could run this guy, and this guy, and suddenly you have an absolute brick wall of just Fear across the board. It's very hard to punch through, and has a really strong attacker at melee, psychic, and ranged. Those 3 together can just be a very frightening piece to put together on the board in the same deck. Then you've got some really good Psychers. This guy's just a standard, very effective Psyker with Brotherhood of Psychers, or the Psychic Link, so he gets more Psychic attack the more Psychers are on the board. This one is an interesting one too. I really want to level this guy up to here. For the price point, really excellent. Another melee specialist who... is he a specialist? Yeah, look at that. He is an actual melee specialist. Look at me learning my keywords. He's a melee specialist, has Fear, really good stats for the price point once you get him leveled up. Even a couple levels of this guy is really good. I still run him from time to time. This is an excellent piece to start out, but once he really starts getting up there in level, excellent piece. One I would consider fully replacing Death Leaper with, but ideally I take both, because they're really good alone, but they're excellent together, because then you can again spread out that Fear and have them both be the melee heavy hitters. Yeah, cool card. I was really excited when that one dropped. These guys are okay. You got your Barrage cards here. They're all right. They don't have the hit points to really give you much defense, and they don't do the damage to really give you much momentum. Even in a Zemet deck, they do some. These 2 as well. Got a Furious Charge in there that's nice and a Big Game Hunter, but eh. You've got your, for a long time, the only taunt card the Tyranids have was this guy. Still very good, because it does have the decent base melee stat and has a bunch of hit points, where the other options are quite squishy. But yeah, it's hard to justify that 19-point price point just for a taunt card. There are not a lot of other mainstay taunt cards in any faction that are that high. So we do have another one of Tyranids, but this one I absolutely love. Got the combination of the primary trait of Poison, awesome. Very high melee, or decent melee, and a very high psychic stat for the cost, and then also has that Warp Surge. So she will apply Poison on the turn that she drops, which is amazing. Even if, say you are forced to a position where you have to play her against something that you know is going to kill her outright, you drop that and she still applies the poison before she's killed, which is really good to kind of have her have an impact on the game, even though she died immediately. So excellent card, mainstay in my Psyker decks. We'll probably look at her again in a minute. On that note, Psyker, high psychic stat, has inspiring presence, has that brotherhood, which both stack to make this guy do, I want to say, it's comfortably over 100 psychic damage if he's on a board full of psychers. I may even be over 200, but we'll look at that in a second. Probably not, but still a lot. And then we get into our target acquired. This is a great piece because melee is now kind of the signature attack type of the Tyranid faction. This guy used to be pretty useless because he was a melee specialist with target acquired when you were only running ranged and psychic decks. Now that I'm running heavy melee decks, this guy is a piece I would put in before I put in any of the taunt cards. Really handy to have. Let's see, this guy gets nerfed and buffed all the time. Secondary trait of poison on an epic. No, don't do it. I don't like it. This little psyker is the one that I'll put in there if I have the points, but it's the first one I'll remove. So if I'm making a psychic deck, I do these two, and then some combination of this guy, this guy, this guy, or hopefully, if you have the points, this guy. Those are really good mainstay psychers, but if you have just the 13 points left over, this one is also an excellent piece to throw in there to kind of touch things up, and also does have a very respectable base psychic attack and the built-in buff to psychic attacks if you have other psychers. Next, we've got this guy is a really, really good stats for 12 points. Mine is low level, so I don't run him, but that melee ready on this cost for that level of melee attack by itself, this is an excellent piece. Of course, you've got the Medicae you're going to run almost every time. Another melee ready that's pretty good. The cheap Death Blow is particularly good in Gosar decks because you can keep this in your deck and just let it charge up all game and then drop it at a moment when your opponent is squishy and have it do the bonus extra damage that's accumulated through the game. Also very good in a Parasite deck just for applying the Parasite explosion stacks. Stocks down on this again because I do think that you want to use your first melee attack. Excuse me. So just to backtrack a bit. So previously the Parasite's ability was not 110%, it was I think 40 and then 60. So either way you sliced it, the first melee attack you made against an opponent was reduced, did less damage. So Furious Charge was good because it would remove that. So you do your initial melee attack, reduce its damage, and then you'd be able to follow up with a full damage primary melee attack. Likewise for this guy, you put Deathblow in there to apply the damage, apply the infect condition to enemy cards so that you didn't waste your damage on your actual full-on shots. But now, since you want that initial attack to be your heavy-hitting one, stocks down on both Deathblow, especially cheap Deathblow, and Furious Charge. So that's a weird spot to find myself in, but I find myself there. You got your range target acquired that also happens to have precision shot. That is one that was a mainstay of my range decks for a long time. Great price point for the precision shot, but he will die basically the turn you play him pretty much every time. I like this guy in combination there. Those two, you've got 18 points, and put those two in and really supercharge your Zima decks. Those are great pieces to put in there. And then we're seeing some of the cheaper cards that have been added more recently. These guys are amazing. A 6-point target acquired. It's a range target acquired, so this is one of the ones I needed before. But this guy is amazing in a Turvagon deck with that Hierophant, the Titan. Because then you've got a cheap card, so you can have the utility of target acquired, but have it be very budget-friendly in terms of your deck points. Very, very good. And similarly, this one has poison, but it is common, so it does actually have useful levels of poison. Yeah, I don't use this guy as much, but the target acquired one I use all the time. Really kind of going to skip over these. He's got Fear, which is nice. You've got to hold down the lane Fear card if you don't really need it. You got to hold down the lane Endless card. That's pretty cool. This one I always like to mention because Zima is the first time you shoot a ranged attack, you get that plus 75% damage. This is Endless, so it counts that at both lives. So it's a 5-point card that does like 70 damage, I think. And then if it dies, it will pop back up and then can do it again. So do the additional 70 damage. So you're looking at like 140 damage out of a 5-point card, which is pretty good. Yeah, if you're running range, definitely a strong piece to consider. I really like this guy. He was changed. I believe he used to have Endless and used to be a different color. And now he has Furious Charge, which was a very powerful piece in my Parasite decks. And still is. It's not the same kind of utility, but it's really good for clearing shields, clearing out injured cards, triggering those Parasite bombs at key places before you actually attack. So that's pretty good. And he's 5 points. I really like having him in there. The Fear one used to be a mainstay of my decks, but now they're a lot more aggressive and a lot more damage heavy, and he's got a very low base damage and ludicrously low hit points. So I did use him at low level but I have not used them in a long time. Kind of talking about these guys. This one is an endless. Yeah, so we got more endless. This one, if you have 4 points left over, you now actually have an option to take taunt, and Tyranids can now take 2 taunt cards, which completely transforms the deck. And I still haven't quite figured out exactly how to run and everything, because he's low level and has been for a long time. And just in general, like, I haven't figured out how to balance it out, but I absolutely love having the option for a 4-point taunt and a 3-point Medicae. I believe that does make it the cheapest Medicae in the entire game, and it fits more the role of what Rippers actually do in the lore, so this is so good. Like, this is a meta-defining card right here. This completely changes what Tyranids are able to do, and allows you to take so many more of the big Gribblies plus Medicae. It's only 4 points cheaper than the other one, but that makes it less than half the cost. And it does give you the option to run 2 Medicae for 10 points, which is also really freaking good. Yeah, and that's kind of the big stuff there. Already kind of touched on the Warlords. Let's look at the decks real quick, and then we'll go into our last faction. This is also getting a little bit long, but hopefully it's been helpful. So the first one we're going to get to see is going to be Zemet. And this is a bit of a strange one because I just got the Hierophant Biotitan, so I'm starting to kind of figure it out and use it. First attack this thing does is 175 damage plus barrage plus poison, so hits really hard. Then I've got 2 target acquireds in there. 2, right? Yeah. 2 target acquired in there just to kind of deal with that. That 5-point I mentioned that does those haymakers that are just really good. 3-point Medicae, and then you've got 2 cheap barrage cards. Just have them in there. So it's fine. I do think the better version of this until my Hierophant is much higher level is going to be that shielded 50-point, and then whatever else fits with the rest there. So if I did that, I'd end up with 60 some odd points to spend, and could bump some of these guys up to more durable cards or throw in another more expensive shooting card as well. So keep an eye on those epic and legendary barrage cards that need to level up a bit, because they are incredibly powerful when you get there. Let's see, who's next? Parasite. I love, love, love this Parasite deck because it's very powerful, very efficient, and leans on a lot of my favorite Tyranid cards. So again, that 66-point Mawloc, Death Leaper, and then the Berserk Deathblow guy over here. Those 3 are just an absolute wall. That's, yes, extremely, extremely good. Punches incredibly hard, triggers the Parasites Infect really, really hard, and has the added utility of the Deathblow there to trigger that as well. They are very durable, so they benefit a lot from the Medicae. I could still tweak this, so drop this guy to the 3-point Medicae, and then... Actually, let's go ahead and do that. Because I want Medicae in here. And then that lets me take this guy and have 11. What do I get at 11? I don't think I get anything very good at 11 points for this deck. Ooh, at 12. Let's take that out too. What do I have at 18? So we get a little bit better where I've got this guy with the Furious Charge, which is pretty good. But what else can I mix in there? So I could do this guy, which has the melee ready, which is really nice to avoid the debuffs and all that. Looking melee heavy, let's go ahead and do that. And that leaves us 6 points. Which we just bumped Shurta back in here. Okay. Yeah, and Shurta's endless. He's nice to hold down lanes and clear shields. Once a card is infected or infested, it doesn't matter what attack type you kill that card with. So him having a ranged attack gives me a little bit of extra flexibility there, even if it is mostly mono melee. I mentioned how good this guy is now in a Parasite deck. Like, I am so happy to be able to run the Lictor because it's just such a cool concept, and combos beautifully with the deck. So there's my Parasite. Look back at the Warlords, and let's see what I have in the other decks real quick. Gosar. And this is that one where it builds up damage over time, so you do kind of want to lean on the durability. So you got my cheap taunt, my Medicae. The 16 and 19 pointers both have really high hit points for the cost. So does the Fear card over here, and then these guys are just very durable. Got that Inspiring Presence to give you that extra edge in case you have to fight quickly. Death Leaper comes in really strong. So what you do here is you take your highest attack stat cards and play them early, and have them try to make a dent and stay alive while your others are charging up for later. Excuse me. This is mostly just a very spread out even deck where my points and stats are spread out among as many cards as possible. I probably should take this guy out and then up some of these a little bit and just spread those points a little more as well, because there are cheaper cards that are very effective. But I will say I do really like the Inspiring Presence on that, and then the base melee attack, and then also that it comes with psychic is really good. So there's a reason it's in there. I actually put it in there because once it got buffed and got the cheaper price point, I wanted to try it out, and this was a kind of my ideal place to put it. Let's see, then we'll go ahead and look at the Turbigon. Yeah, so again, running a thin deck. This is actually a little bit thicker than I would normally do. Got the double Medicae because most of this is leaning on my Hierophant. And then, of course, this is not a full deck by any means, so that I am able to run the... so I make sure I know when the Termagant is available, and make sure it is available as often as possible. So, yeah, so you'll have that infinite play card to kind of shore this up because it looks very thin. I believe I saw in the Discord some time ago there was a 4 bodyguard deck as kind of the standard Turbigon deck, but it wasn't very effective for a long time. So I am curious to see if this outperforms it, but several of these key cards are low level. The 6-point target acquired, and then especially my Hierophant, so it's kind of a tricky balance. But my Turbigon's high level, so we'll see. Almost done here. The Flyrant. Now, the Flyrant is a straight-up pressure deck, so you're dealing constant damage to your opponent every single turn. My personal thing when you have that is I want to follow it up, right? So I've got Psionic Blast in here, I've got Poison in here, I've got Deathblow in here, just things that will stack additional damage on top of the cards that are already getting hit by the Flyrant. This is also a pretty punchy deck, so these 5 Psychers together will keep the board doing a lot of psychic damage over a pretty impressive amount of time. So they're in there trying to punch through opponents and get topped off by the damage from the Flyrant, and then also most of them have the Psychic Link, which benefits from the Flyrant itself being on the board. So this is a pretty solid deck, but it's one that only really works because all of these cards are high level. So I wouldn't do anything like this to start out. But Poison, Psionic Blast, Deathblow are all things that are really good in combo with that, just like free damage across there. And then, of course, we have the Swarmlord himself. Should be my full Psychers deck. And it's squishy. Just go ahead and talk about this. I talked about this a little bit when we looked at some of the bodyguards. The Swarmlord itself is so durable, you can have a fragile team around it. You can see I shuffled this around, right? So normally I mentioned I have the 13-point Psyker in there to wrap this up. It's good, but it doesn't compare with these guys. They do so much damage. Plus this guy with the utility, and then this guy with the poison. And then, of course, the Medicae, who I usually drop to top off the Swarmlord when he deploys. And then, of course, my Swarmlord is quite high level as well. I start getting this guy up here, and then he's a real monster. But he already is here with 3 shields and rank 2 Inspiring Presence. He's a really powerful piece to put on the board. Especially since you're doing psychic attacks most all game, you will build up some melee attack, which stacks with his really high melee attack, and he can often one-shot opposing warlords in the endgame. So, very, very good. This is my psychic build. I absolutely love having the 4-point taunt in there and also having the target acquired in there without losing any of my power pieces. So I was really happy when I was able to do that. That is our Tyranids in a nutshell. We have one more faction we're going to go ahead and look at. This will be very quick because there's not a lot to it. That is going to be our Leagues Votann. And of the two, they're both really good, especially starting out. Of the two, I personally think Etok is better because of this Null Vortex. So the first card you deploy every turn, it has a Null Vortex where the card opposite it, once deployment is complete, will have its trait removed. Like my favorite example is, say you're across from an Endless card, now you only have to kill 1 copy of it and they're both gone because you removed the Endless trait before you killed it. There's a timer on that. The traits will come back, but I believe it's 3 turns, yes. And it occurs before any trait triggers, which is really, really good. And one of the things that makes this so powerful is if you land it against an enemy warlord, it will actually turn off their warlord trait as well. So say you're up against a Shadow Sun deck, you drop your Null Vortex card where you know Shadow Sun is going to be, and then the injured cards on the flanks will not be healed, so you have additional time to kill them before it comes back. Likewise, shields. You drop a Null Vortex across from shields, it will strip the shields, and you have time to kill that card before the shields come back. But you better do it, because otherwise you punch a bunch of damage into it, and then it has the near invincibility of getting its shields back. But in terms of, in upper tier ladder play, Etok is extremely good, because being able to remove those traits, and especially those warlord traits, can be really clutch. But also at low level, he's really powerful, because removing your opponent's traits is one of the most effective toolboxy ways to nerf them. Make them easier to kill, make them do less damage, take out whatever synergies or combos they were relying on. It is a awesome ability. And then he himself is okay. He's cheap. He's got a decent psychic attack stat. It has that inspiring presence, and he also usually has that null vortex trigger on most of the time when you play him, and often that will be against an opposing warlord, which is just amazing. So he's the better of the two. Uthar's ability relies on your cards dying, which technically Etox does as well, because you have to deploy a card fresh to actually trigger it. But Uthar's is, whenever an enemy card destroys a friendly card, it gains a judgment token. For each judgment token a card has, it loses a minimum of 15% of its starting wounds when damaged by an attack. The card may stack up to 3 of these. Now the good news is on that is that if you are, say there's a 100 hit point base card across from you, it has gotten 3 kills. Every time you clip it, even for a single damage, instead of taking 1, it will take either, it's 100 total and that's 3, so that's 45% of its starting health. So if you hit it for 1 hit point, 3 times, it's dead. So it's really effective, but of course it relies both on stacking slowly, because it's only 15% per stack, which adds up a lot if it has high hit point space. But then also your cards have to die to trigger this. So he's incredibly strong if you're up against something like a Abaddon deck that's like a 4 warlord or a 4-card deck. Super good. But against most other things, you have to fall back on Uthar's base stats. And that is one thing about him, is that both Uthar and Votann have such good stats that he's still a really effective warlord, just consider his ability kind of gravy. And it can be real nasty if you have a power piece. Like I've talked about my really big barrage cards. If they're clearing a board a couple times, then any return fire will just wipe them like nobody's business. So that's what you need to watch for against this guy, and that's the thing you kind of work for if you run this guy. But again, it requires, there's a lag, right? So not only does it require that your cards die, then it's over time. So it affects future attacks or future damage that they take, and stacks up over time. So they have to kill 3 of your cards to really get a really noticeable damage boost. So it's very easy to peter out before you see a big benefit from the judgment tokens. This is the thing. Especially since Votann kind of culturally are never going to have any endless. They just never will. Teeny tiny pool of cards. This really, if you're playing Votann, it's just a matter of bringing your most powerful or your highest leveled cards. There are a couple things. I'll go ahead and start at the top with these guys. There's not a whole lot. I would never ever leave home without your target acquired and your taunt in Etok decks. And of course these guys do lean really heavily on range. They've got really powerful range cards, and most of my most effective decks have been melee heavy. And my Votann cards, I've been playing every single Votann campaign and leveling them like crazy, but they still are fairly low level. Actually, they're looking pretty good recently. Yeah. But, yeah. So I have been leveling these up as my underdogs that I'm, facing an uphill battle leveling them, but at this point, or playing them, but at this point they're doing pretty good. Your target acquired and your taunt are both really, really strong in Etok decks, because if you keep your target acquired as your null vortex drop, and then you can choose, do I remove endless, do I remove shields, do I take off inspiring presence from this thing before I kill it? And then you can focus fire too. So that shields example I gave, your worst possible nightmare is you get something down to 10% wounds, and then your null vortex fails, and suddenly it's got 4 shields. And you have to punch all the way through those shields to do that final 10 damage. Target acquired helps to avoid that, where you have a couple turns where you can burn it down while the null vortex is on, applied by the target acquired guy. So that's really good. And then, of course, the taunt one is another good piece that you put across from something expecting it to die, which does let you kind of redeploy and move your null vortexes around. So, really good taunt card. It's good just on the face of it, but those 2 are utility pieces I try to put in every single one of my decks, especially my Etok decks. Going on through, we've got a couple death blows. Yep, there's a death blow. And death blow is really good with Uthar. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that death blow... So Uthar's bonus damage will trigger from the judgment tokens on something. So before death blow triggers, I think I might have that wrong. I don't really remember that, but anyway, if settings already have judgment tokens, especially multiple, if you drop death blow in there, it does a lot more damage than it normally would. Then you get a nice 6-point taunt. That's good too. But yeah, so just to have kind of a limited pool of options. They do have the one Psyker, who's very good because he has the base shields and does a bunch of damage. Bunch of damage. Yeah, really good one. Combo is great again with Etalk because Etalk is a Psyker as well. So you have these two as your end game pieces. They will do a bunch of psychic damage in the final game and hopefully bring something down before they die. But my mainstay pieces, of course, are going to be your Medicae, going to be your ranged ready is really strong just for the cost or the stats. And then, of course, this guy as being your kind of workhorse barrage and ranged ready is really, really, really good. Those will be good both in Uthar and Etalk decks, but I particularly enjoy them in Uthar decks. Then, of course, you've got your heavy punching tanks. This one of mine is very low level. I'd love to see this one get higher level, but we'll get there. We'll get there. But yeah, it becomes a literal tank when you get a couple levels into it. Then you've got some Furious Charge. And you like good melee mix in there too. But really, again, the key ones are going to be your Barrage cards, your Deathblow cards, your target acquired cards, and then your taunt cards are really, really good. Melee is better right now, but the Votan's ranged is still so much better than their melee that I still play ranged pretty much every time. You can mix it in and have a little melee, but you want to check these and be like, all right, I could have this guy with 29 ranged, or I can shuffle some points around to take this guy with 39 ranged. 65, 71. Yeah, so just better stats all around. Yeah. So you can look at these. I like the heavy hitter ones. They are a lot like Custodians, and they have kind of balanced ranged and melee attacks, leaning a little bit higher on melee. Their hit points aren't great, but they're cheap too, so it's kind of a mixed bag. So Votan is a little bit tricky to tip for and talk about because it's such a thin faction right now, but that is improving, so I'm pretty excited to see where this winds up. Stock's way up in precision shot in your Uthar decks, because anything that has judgment tokens will also take additional damage from your on-the-drop attack. So Furious Charge, Precision Shot, Barrage, they don't have Psionic Blast, but yeah, very, very good to help kind of chip damage away from these folks. Anyway, I think that's it. I believe that is our final one. Hopefully I didn't double up on any factions and miss one. But yeah, let me know what you think. I would love to hear any critique or criticism or anything you especially liked. Anyway, cheers. Till next time.